Well, I'm just doing this to tape the goatee. Pretty soon I won't have it. Um, and I now have some blinds on my window there. That's kind of interesting. Um, what else are we saying? Well, we were talking a lot about Gen X and just the way in which they've kind of, in the 21st century, really fucked a lot of things up. And as I was saying, that in the 1990s, you really didn't have. I don't feel like there was a set of beliefs that you had to adhere to in order to be considered or accepted by liberals, as is the case in the 21st century. Um, I feel like in the 90s there was a celebration of eccentricity, of thinking outside the box, or being extreme in various ways, and if anything, the more outlandish ideas were welcome, and that was sort of, I mean, early Gen X is something very different from 21st century Gen X, and we were just talking about that. I'm just saying this so that I can record my goatee. Here it is, and so we were saying, what about um, what else can we say about this? Um, well, again, many Gen Xers are sort of, to some degree, they may be into mysticism on some level or whatever else, but it's really characteristic of the 21st century Gen Xer that they are acting as thought police. They're playing the kind of role of the liberal inquisition, as I see them. They are out to shame and ridicule and harass anyone who does not adhere to their dogma. And is this still recording? Uh, and this is nothing like the way things were in the 20th century. It's interesting, like, I'm a turn of the century person, and when I was a kid, thinking about being a turn of the century person, I never thought of myself in terms of being a turn of the century person. I was fascinated even in high school, I think, with the people who lived in the 1890s and what it must have been like to live around the turn of the century in the year 1900 and all this. And I never really thought about it in terms of my own self and what that would be like. But I always had that fantasy, as I think many people of my generation did. And I remember even talking with Lynn about this at one point, and I feel like we both sort of realized, like, oh yeah, we're going to live through something like that, because this was before it had happened and whatever else. And when you're young, these sort of things seem very far away. Like 10 years is a long time away, and you don't really think of it anyway. So, um, it was always kind of a fantasy for me to live through something like that, to be this kind of turn of the century person. Now I've realized that as a turn of the century person, meaning that you've lived, particularly when it hit my generation, I would say that we're sort of traumatized by it. I think people who were a little bit older got in early enough that they could kind of get in there as before the whole thing kind of shifted and kind of closed down in a lot of ways. Um, and then the people who come after are just kind of born into a different set of conditions and don't really think about it. But I think that for my generation, it was a little more of a traumatic thing or maybe I'm just a generally damaged, traumatized person, and I see everything in this sense. But I do think it was somewhat traumatizing for my generation. I mean, there are those of my generation who got in early, a kind of Leonardo DiCaprio or these other figures who made it in the 90s. But for the most part, people don't make it until their mid 20s or thereabouts. I mean, just on average. And particularly if you want to be a film director or something like that, or a novelist or something. Um, so for my generation, born teenagers of the '90s, a time when goatees, no, a time when the arts were really king. This was a traumatic shift. Now we're living in the technology world. We all have smartphones.